Hey guys, welcome to episode 5. As promised, we're going to explore beyond the limits. But for this, we have a real expert, Joe Hountondji from the Red Bull Driftbrother.
Hey guys,
How are you?
good to see you.
Welcome, man.
Good to see you.
Hey, good to see
You too. As you have seen, it's incredible what you can do, what you guys can do. It's crazy. But I know that you, Nils, have a bit of a history with Joe in sim racing. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I think it's probably best if he tells us about it. But of course, during the pandemic, we've been a bit in touch, and we showed each other what we do. So what do you in fact do when you do sim racing? How did you start with that?
Well, actually, sim racing for us was a big part of getting us where we are today. We didn't have the opportunity to get the seat time you would need to become a professional motorsport athlete. So sim was actually our way to getting experience, to experiencing all those different, not all of them, but at least a portion of those different situations that can come up in competition for us. Because every car, every driver is different in drifting. You have to train your muscle memory a lot. If you have to think about what to do in situations, you know that. You're way too slow. It's all over by then. So just being there and getting the repetition, getting the hours in, huge difference for us. And therefore you get a lot of exposure to different driving technique, driving styles, mistakes that can happen. You can try stuff a lot more freely than if Mr. Motorsport standing right behind you and looking at a budget for messing up. So it gives you a lot of freedom, the simulation world, to just experiment, go wild. You can try setup changes and feel the effects of what it does to the behavior of the car. And you can do all of that without all of the effort, all the resources needed to do it in the real car. But then also, a while ago, we were intensifying the hours of being on the sim and started to dabble a tiny bit, always been interested, always been a fan of racing, of what you guys do. Always been so impressed with how precise you guys are, lap after lap after lap after lap. And I knew what I was in for because this is a different craft. Racing is just, I can carry over some elements from what I've learned in my drifting, like understanding the language the car is trying to communicate to me, having a feel for the car. But other than that, it's about another 20 years I would need to put in to get anywhere close where you guys are, obviously. But Nils tried to help me out. It was an amazing experience to equip or to use also things like telemetry. So we worked with telemetry, looked at what I do actually behind the wheel on the pedals and where I'm losing time, where my racing craft, we can't really call it that, but my
Not weaknesses, but areas of improvement.
Yeah, and we found many, right? There were plenty.
Yeah, there was something. And then the interesting part was afterwards for me when we were switching sides and you were showing me the drifting stuff in sim racing, which was always very invisible to me because it never really mattered. But it was fun to say the least. So we're looking at ACC now. And ACC obviously simulates GT racing. So we have the GT3s, GT4s, now we also have the M2 CS Racing. And all these cars, they do have traction control.
Obviously, yeah.
Which I guess you don't have in...
No, we're not allowed to have traction control. Would be quite interesting because you could do some pretty crazy stuff in terms of being faster, even sideways.
And it would also probably avoid some smoke that you kind of need in what you do?
Yeah, it's an element. So if you don't stick it to the door where actually the smoke of the lead car sort of goes underneath your car as a chaser and allows you to at least see his front wheel. Mm-hmm. In transition, you're blind. So there's always some split seconds in the transitions where you have to dig through the smoke. So for this, we're in a GT4 car, I suppose?
Exactly, so the M4 GT4 here. So the first thing we do is take the traction control and just, turn it off.
Yeah, I like that.
Are there more things we could do to make the drifting a bit more predictable?
I would actually, to get started, reduce traction, reduce grip, and therefore either increase tire pressures in the rear or stiffen up the suspension. Dampers, spring rates, stuff like that are some easy things you can do if you want the car to slide easier. But that's not what we're here to do today. We want to sort of use whatever you would use in a race and see what we can do.
Without doing too much.
We're going a bit, over the
Okay.
limit. I know you do push quite a lot, and I did see you, and excited
Okay,
to
so
see.
instead of adjusting the car and dialing it in for drifting, we'll just use the popometer and see where we end up.
There we go.
But maybe so I'll have a straight ahead. So maybe you talk about how you get the car in a situation that the rear end actually steps out.
So we want to drift this upcoming corner. I would suggest to do a little weight shift, a little weight transfer. There you go, the Scandinavian flick. Oh, look at this, a real pro.
But that was already a bit of a
prepared.
tank slammer that we spoke about earlier. Not
It was
because
close.
of traction control, but
It was close to biting you, the little snake. But you controlled it. I like it. Can you guess how many hours you've spent?
as with everything that you do professionally, I think the saying is you have to do like 10,000 hours to get good.
Yeah.
And I've done that probably already 15 years ago. So make that 20,000 hours on a sim is probably not going to be a stretch.
You just have to really, really indulge in your craft. And Nils is just killing the sideways right now. I think this is an application to Red Bull Driftbrother's drifting squad. This is looking proper. You can see how Nils is using the weight of the car. You can see him sometimes tapping the brake pedal a tiny bit. And this helps to position the weight of the car coming up to the turn where you want it. And if you want to put the car sideways, obviously if you're braking, you're going to shift a lot of the weight to the front. You're going to make the rear lighter, the rear end of the car, and that's going to help you make the rear end slip or step out, initiate drift, if you will. I would say this is already pretty much Driftbrother's approved for a GT4 car.
I've in my life actually never really written a lot of CVs. I always kind of ended up in jobs. So I take the next one.
There we go. Can you come up with a situation in a race where you can actually benefit of this skill set in a racing situation?
Of course, if I just pretend like driving the normal line now, so braking the corner on the outside, then aiming normally for the apex, and then the issue always is, where is the limit here, right? So if I just slam the power, I just get this power slide on the exits, and now I have a feeling for when the traction control normally takes away power from the car, right? So I get an understanding, where am I challenging the car?
The physical limits of the setup of the car.
Which often is masked by the traction control that just helps a tiny bit too much, right? So if I go into this here now, I have much more control with the throttle to get the rear end around and can position the car a bit more nicely. And maybe this are the things that help you in the end, understanding that there's more to play with than just relying on the electronics, but instead using them to your advantage, going slightly above the limit to position the car a tiny bit better.
Are there situations where you would say, yeah, it makes sense, it's gonna make me a quicker driver if I go into almost understeer or almost oversteer, or a tiny amount of them?
Absolutely. Of course, it's track dependent, it's car dependent, but most of the race cars we drive are rear wheel driven, right? So most of the time we'll have an issue with rear tire wear being a bit more than the fronts. So what we're sometimes doing then is drive the corners a bit tighter, not use all the track, not throw it in as aggressively, but instead drive a bit shallow into the corner and try to use a bit more of the front axle and avoid all this drifting that we're trying to
use more of
produce
the
right now.
front axle, you mean also challenge the front axle?
Yeah.
And almost overdrive it. This is like understeering. You get the car to understeer, which sort of scrubs the front end and generates more heat in the front tires. And
If you need that.
If you need it, if you want it.
But it also brings the tire wear back in balance sometimes, right? When the rear end has already dropped off a bit, okay, maybe I need 2 laps now, where just use the front a tiny bit more. Of course, we're doing it not as aggressively as this, right? Because that would just eat them up, cause graining, blistering, whatever. But just doing this a subtle amount, and I'll just try it this one time. You go in here and then a tiny bit more than I would actually need to make the corner. And then I can bring the car back into balance. I think this is where the whole playing around with where the limit of the rear end is gives you an understanding of which axle you use in which situation.
almost finished your winning lap. Now we need to see, go down there. Look, the spectators
Yeah,
are
I
going
think
crazy.
there's a big area down
They're
there
going
somewhere.
in. You got to give them a celebration.
Let's try if we can flamboyantly go into that.
Nice, 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 nice. Yep, as Homer Simpson says, donut time.
Guys, this was it for episode 5. The guys are still practicing. Joe, thank you very much for being with us. It was
My
awesome
pleasure.
to have you. Now we have a big surprise for the next episode. The guys don't know about it, so stay tuned.